You lied, the judge said, staring down at the teenage girl from his high bench. His voice was calm, but his eyes held sharp suspicion. The courtroom was silent. Everyone leaned forward in their seats. Even the bailiff, who had been standing stiff by the door, took a small step closer. The girl, only 16, sat at the witness stand. She had short, dark curls that framed her face, and she was wearing a simple white blouse and black skirt. Her expression was unreadable, except for the hint of amusement flickering in her deep brown eyes. "I didn't lie, Your Honor," she said smoothly, her voice steady. The judge smirked. "Then prove it. We're going to play a little game. Truth or lie. I ask a question, you answer. If I catch you in a lie, we'll know exactly what kind of witness you are." The courtroom erupted in whispers. A game? In court? Was the judge serious? The girl tilted her head slightly, as if she were studying him. "You want to play a game of truth and lies with me?" There was something in her tone, something that made the judge pause. "Yes," he said, straightening in his chair. "Are you afraid?" She smiled. "You should be asking yourself that question, Your Honor." A ripple of gasps swept through the courtroom. The judge's smirk faded. The room tensed as he cleared his throat, suddenly unsure. Because what he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that he had just challenged a legal genius with an IQ higher than most lawyers in the country. And she was about to turn the game against him. It had all started 3 weeks earlier. The first time Sarah Jacobs had stepped into a courtroom, she hadn't been on trial. She hadn't even been a witness. She had been sitting quietly in the back row, watching a case unfold. She loved the law. It fascinated her. The way words could shape reality. The way arguments could twist and turn like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Most kids her age spent their weekends watching movies or hanging out with friends. Sarah spent hers reading legal textbooks. She had been watching a theft trial that day, a simple case. A man accused of stealing from a grocery store. The evidence was weak. The defense attorney was sloppy. Sarah had seen it all, the inconsistencies, the missteps. And then, when the verdict had been announced, she had done something reckless. She had stood up. "That's not right," she had said, her voice loud enough to carry across the courtroom. Heads had turned. The judge, the same one who now sat across from her in the present, had raised his brows. "Excuse me." Sarah had hesitated for only a second. Then she had squared her shoulders and spoken again. "The evidence doesn't add up. The security footage had a timestamp that contradicts the cashier's statement. And the bag the man was carrying wasn't even the same color as the stolen goods packaging." Murmurs had spread. The defense attorney had scrambled to respond. The judge had called for order. And then, the case had been overturned. Just like that. That was the first time Sarah had changed the course of a trial. But it hadn't been the last. Now, she was sitting in the witness chair, facing the judge who had doubted her before. "You claim you saw what happened the night of the accident," the judge said, his voice firm. "But your story conflicts with another witness's account. So, let's test your honesty. Truth or lie, you saw the entire event unfold without missing a second." Sarah crossed her arms, leaning back slightly. "Truth." The judge nodded. "And you're sure of that?" "Absolutely." "Then tell me, how many cars passed before the accident occurred?" A few people in the courtroom chuckled. He thought he had trapped her. Sarah didn't hesitate. 6. The judge blinked. 6. "Yes," she said simply. 3 went by in the opposite direction. 2 passed before the light turned yellow. The last one was a red sedan. It barely made it through before the crash happened. The courtroom fell silent. The judge glanced at his notes. His brow furrowed. She was right. "All right," he said, tapping his pen against his desk. "Truth or lie?" You could see the driver's face clearly. "Truth." "What color were his eyes?" Sarah smiled again. "Green." But his passenger had blue eyes. She was the one yelling before impact. A stunned silence filled the air. The judge shifted in his seat. He hadn't expected this. His game had just started. And already, he was losing. 3 weeks ago, before Sarah had ever stepped into a courtroom, she had been an ordinary girl. Or at least, that's what people thought. She had grown up in a small town outside of Chicago. Her mother had worked long hours as a nurse, and her father had left when she was just a baby. Life hadn't been easy. They had struggled with bills, with food, with everything. But Sarah had learned something important from her mother. Kindness mattered. Even when they had nothing, her mother had always found ways to help others. She volunteered at shelters, She took care of elderly neighbors. She taught Sarah that intelligence wasn't just about knowing facts. It was about using what you knew to make the world better. That was why Sarah loved the law. Because laws could protect people. And sometimes, they could hurt people too, if used unfairly. So when she had seen innocent people getting treated unfairly in court, she hadn't been able to sit back and do nothing. She had spoken up. She had proven her points. And now, she was here, playing a game of truth and lies with a judge who had no idea what he was up against. The judge cleared his throat. All right, one more question. Sarah nodded. Go ahead. He leaned forward slightly. Truth or lie? You have never lied in court before. Sarah's smile didn't fade. But this time, she didn't answer right away. The room tensed. The judge narrowed his eyes. What's the matter? You seem so confident. Sarah tapped her fingers on the armrest. I'm just wondering, she said thoughtfully, if you actually want to know the answer, or if you just assumed you already do. A hush fell over the courtroom, and for the first time since the game had started, the judge hesitated. The courtroom felt frozen in time. Everyone waited for Sarah's answer. The judge's fingers tapped against his desk. Well, he said, his voice edged with impatience. Truth or lie? Sarah exhaled slowly, tilting her head as if considering the weight of the question. Then, she met his gaze. Truth. I've never lied in court before. The judge smirked, leaning back. And I'm supposed to believe that? Sarah raised an eyebrow. You're the one who suggested this game, Your Honor. Do you doubt your own rules? A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge's smirk faded slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. Very well, he said. Let's continue. He glanced at his notes. You claim to have seen the accident from across the street. But the lighting was poor, and the rain was heavy. Are you telling me you could see through the storm clearly? Sarah nodded. Yes. The judge scoffed. Truth or lie? Truth, she said again, without hesitation. Impossible, the judge shot back. The rain was pouring that night. No one could have had a clear view. Sarah's lips twitched. Then how did the security cameras capture the accident clearly? The judge blinked. The footage from the gas station across the street, Sarah continued. The rain was heavy, but the headlights from the cars and the bright store signs lit up the area. The camera saw everything. And so did I. A sharp silence filled the courtroom. The judge glanced at the prosecutor. Is there security footage? The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Yes, Your Honor. But we hadn't presented it yet. Sarah's expression didn't change. Maybe you should have. The judge's jaw tightened. He knew now. This girl wasn't just confident. She was prepared. And worse, she was right. Before Sarah had ever stepped foot in a courtroom, she had learned something important about people. People in power didn't always like to be questioned. When she was younger, she had watched her mother argue with their landlord. He had raised the rent unfairly, claiming their apartment needed extra maintenance fees. Sarah, only 10 at the time, had found the lease agreement in a drawer and read every word. The lease clearly stated that the maintenance fees were included in the rent. When her mother confronted the landlord with this information, he had laughed. That's cute, he had said. Did your kid tell you that? Sarah had stepped forward. Actually, she had said, holding up the contract. It says right here that you can't do that. So if you charge us extra, it's illegal. The landlord had gone red in the face. He had threatened to evict them, but Sarah knew the law. He couldn't kick them out without proper notice. In the end, he had backed down. That was the first time Sarah had realized the power of knowledge. It wasn't about being the loudest person in the room. It was about knowing what was right and proving it. The judge exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. He had underestimated her. He turned another page in his notes, searching for something, anything, to trip her up. All right, he said. One final question. Sarah leaned forward. I'm listening. The judge steepled his fingers. Truth or lie? You had a personal reason to be at the scene of the accident that night. For the first time, Sarah hesitated. The room felt even quieter than before. The judge's eyes narrowed. Well, Sarah tapped her fingers against the armrest. That's a tricky question, Your Honor. Why? Because whether it's truth or lie depends on how you define personal reason. The judge frowned. What do you mean? Sarah glanced at the people in the courtroom, the lawyers, the spectators, the defendant. Then, she turned back to the judge. Let's just say, I had a reason to be there, she said slowly. The judge leaned forward. Was it personal or not? Sarah exhaled. Truth. Another wave of murmurs swept through the room. The judge's eyes gleamed. He finally had something. Then tell me, he said. What was your reason? Sarah's fingers curled slightly around the armrest. The answer hung in the air, unspoken. The judge waited. The courtroom waited. And then, the doors burst open. A man stormed inside. His face flushed, his suit wrinkled. Your Honor, he called out, his voice breathless. There's been a development in the case. The courtroom turned toward him. Sarah's lips parted slightly. She knew that man. And if he was here, it meant the truth she had been holding back was about to come out. The entire courtroom turned as the man rushed forward. His hair was disheveled, his tie was loose, and his face looked like he had just sprinted down a long hallway. The bailiff instinctively stepped forward to stop him, but the judge raised a hand. Hold on, the judge said, his voice firm. Who are you? The man took a deep breath, straightening his tie. My name is Daniel Graves. I'm an attorney representing an anonymous party related to this case. And I have new evidence that changes everything. A hushed murmur spread through the crowd. Sarah sat motionless in the witness chair, her expression unreadable. But deep inside, her heart pounded. She knew Daniel Graves, and she knew exactly who his anonymous party was. The judge's eyes narrowed. New evidence. This case has been going on for weeks. Why wasn't this brought forward earlier? Daniel licked his lips, hesitating. Because certain people didn't want it to be found. He shot a glance toward the prosecutor's table. The prosecutor stiffened. The tension in the room thickened. The judge sighed. Very well. Bailiff, take the evidence and hand it to the clerk. The bailiff took a thick manila folder from Daniel's hands and walked it over to the clerk, who placed it on the judge's bench. Sarah watched silently. She already knew what was inside. She had spent weeks piecing the truth together. And now, everything was about to come crashing down. The judge flipped through the pages. His face changed as he read. His brows furrowed. Then his eyes widened. Then, slowly, he looked up at Sarah. You knew, he said quietly. Sarah didn't blink. Yes. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge turned back to Daniel. Is this confirmed? Daniel nodded. It is, Your Honor. The truth was buried, but she found it. Silence. Heavy. Unspoken. Then, the judge closed the folder, exhaling sharply. This changes everything, he muttered. And in that moment, Sarah knew. The case was about to explode. 3 weeks ago, before all of this began, Sarah had been sitting at her usual spot in the town's small library. She was surrounded by stacks of law books, a notepad filled with scribbled notes, and a cold cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. She was researching something, a case that didn't sit right with her. It had started as a simple curiosity. A man was being charged for a hit-and-run accident that had left a woman critically injured. The evidence against him seemed solid. Witnesses, camera footage, even his own shaky alibi. But something didn't feel right. Sarah had learned to trust that feeling. She had gone through every detail, every report, every testimony. And then, buried deep in the files, she had found it. A missing piece. A timestamp that didn't match. A witness statement that had been altered. A license plate that was 1 digit off. Someone had lied. And Sarah was determined to find out why. Now, standing before the judge, she watched as the weight of that truth settled over the room. You knew, the judge repeated, his voice quieter this time. Sarah met his gaze. I knew something was wrong. I just had to prove it. The judge sat back, rubbing his temple. And you waited until now? Sarah shook her head. No, I was waiting for the right moment. The moment where people would actually listen. The judge exhaled sharply. This game we played. This truth or lie. He glanced down at the folder. You were playing a different game all along, weren't you? Sarah's lips curled slightly. I told you, Your Honor, she said. You should have asked yourself if you were ready to play with me. A stunned silence filled the room. Then, the judge chuckled, just once. A short, quiet laugh. Unbelievable, he muttered. You're a 16-year-old kid, and you just did what trained attorneys couldn't. Sarah shrugged. The truth doesn't care about age, Your Honor. The judge shook his head. Then he turned to Daniel Graves. Mr. Graves, we'll need to verify all of this. But if what's in these files is accurate, then we're reopening this case immediately. Daniel nodded. Understood, Your Honor. The judge slammed his gavel. Court is in recess. The room erupted into whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Lawyers exchanged nervous glances. Sarah stood up from the witness chair. She had done what she came to do. But she wasn't finished yet. Because now, the real battle was about to begin. The moment the judge declared recess, the courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to make phone calls. Lawyers whispered urgently among themselves. And the prosecutor was already rushing toward Daniel Graves, demanding to see the new evidence. But Sarah? Sarah walked straight to the back of the room, toward a familiar figure standing near the exit. A tall man in a gray coat. His face was partially hidden under the brim of a cap, but Sarah recognized him instantly. "You came," she said, stopping in front of him. The man nodded. "I told you I would." Sarah studied his face carefully. He looked exhausted, his sharp features worn down by stress, his blue eyes clouded with worry. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. The man exhaled, shaking his head. "Yes, I did. You're not the only one who cares about the truth, kid." Sarah bit the inside of her cheek. She knew that, but it didn't make what was coming any easier. Because now, the people who had buried the truth weren't going to sit quietly. Now, they were going to fight back. 3 weeks earlier, Sarah had found the first crack in the case. The hit and run had seemed open and shut at first. A man named Victor Larson had been arrested, charged, and thrown into jail, awaiting trial. The evidence had seemed airtight, until Sarah started digging. The timestamp on the traffic camera footage was off by exactly 2 minutes. That alone wasn't enough to prove anything. But then she found the second problem. The key witness had originally described the car as dark green. But the car Victor Larson had been driving that night? It was black. At first, it seemed like a simple mistake. Until Sarah found something much worse. A police report that had been edited. The original witness statement had been changed. Someone had crossed out the word green and replaced it with black. Someone had lied, and Sarah needed to know why. Now, standing in the courtroom hallway, she looked up at the man in the gray coat. "Victor's wife still doesn't know the truth, does she?" she asked. The man hesitated. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No, she still thinks he's guilty." Sarah exhaled sharply. "That's going to change." The man's gaze darkened. "Yeah, but once the real people behind this case realize we're getting close to the truth, they won't just sit back and let it happen." Sarah knew that. She had already noticed strange things happening ever since she started asking questions. A man in a black car had followed her home 2 nights ago. Her school library's computer system had mysteriously locked her out when she tried searching for police records. And now, someone had finally tried to bury the evidence for good. But they had failed. And Sarah wasn't stopping now. Back in the courtroom, the judge returned from recess, his expression grim. After reviewing the evidence presented by Mr. Graves, "I am ordering this case to be reopened for further investigation," he announced. Gasps rippled through the audience. The prosecutor paled. But, the judge continued, "I also have concerns about how this evidence was obtained. A 16-year-old girl should not be conducting legal investigations." His gaze shifted toward Sarah. "You are not a lawyer. You are not an investigator. You are a witness, and that is all." Sarah held his stare. "With all due respect, Your Honor, if I hadn't found the truth, an innocent man would be sitting in prison right now." A few reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. The judge sighed. "I'm not saying you were wrong," he admitted. "I'm saying you put yourself in danger. And I want to know why." Sarah hesitated. She could feel the weight of the courtroom pressing in on her. Then, she took a breath. "Because I believe the law should be fair," she said simply. The room went silent. The judge studied her carefully. For the first time, his expression softened. Then he nodded. "Fair enough." He turned to the attorneys. "This case is officially reopened. Court adjourned for today." The gavel struck. And just like that, the fight was only beginning. Sarah stepped outside the courthouse, feeling the cold air hit her face. Daniel Graves walked up beside her. "You know this isn't over, right?" he said. Sarah nodded. "I know. The people behind this, they're powerful. And they're not going to let the truth come out so easily." Sarah met his gaze. "Then we'll just have to be smarter than them." Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then he chuckled. "You really are something else, kid." Sarah shrugged. "I get that a lot." But as they walked toward the street, a black car sat parked across the road, its engine running. The tinted window rolled down, just slightly. A pair of eyes watched them, waiting. And Sarah knew. This was far from over. Sarah felt the weight of the eyes watching her. The black car across the street was still, but she knew it wasn't there by accident. Someone was inside. someone who had been watching her for days. She didn't look directly at it. Instead, she turned to Daniel Graves. "How much danger are we really in?" she asked quietly. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "A lot," he admitted. "These people don't just lie in court. They cover their tracks in ways that don't leave loose ends." Sarah understood what he meant. If they had gone so far as to manipulate evidence, change witness statements, and frame an innocent man, then they weren't going to just walk away now that she had uncovered the truth. They were going to fight back, and she needed to be ready. 2 days earlier, Sarah had received an anonymous message on her phone. A blocked number. Just 3 words. "Stop asking questions." Most people would have been scared. Most people would have taken the warning seriously and backed off. Sarah wasn't most people. Instead of stopping, she had started digging deeper. She had found hidden records in police reports, documents that had been removed from the official case files. She had traced the prosecutor's connections, uncovering a suspicious link between him and a wealthy businessman known for making legal troubles disappear. And then, she had found the biggest clue of all. The real car from the hit-and-run accident? It hadn't been Victor Larsen's at all. It belonged to someone much, much more powerful. And that was the truth that had put her in danger. Now, standing on the courthouse steps, she knew she had a choice. She could walk away. She could pretend she had never found the evidence. She could pretend she hadn't seen the truth staring her in the face. But that wasn't who she was. So instead, she turned to Daniel. "What's our next move?" Daniel hesitated. "Sarah, I need you to think about this carefully. If you push any further, you won't just be dealing with lawyers and judges anymore. You'll be dealing with people who make problems disappear." Sarah met his gaze. "Good thing I don't plan on disappearing." Daniel sighed, shaking his head. "You really are fearless, aren't you?" "Not fearless," she corrected. "Just determined." A hint of a smile crossed Daniel's face. "All right, kid. Then we fight back." That night, Sarah sat at her desk, staring at the papers spread out before her. She had spent the past 3 weeks collecting everything. Witness reports, camera footage, timestamps, background checks, every single detail that didn't add up. And at the center of it all was one name. Harrison Locke. A billionaire. A political donor. A man whose name was whispered in courtrooms but never written in legal files. A man who had the power to make people disappear. And his son, his reckless, spoiled son, had been driving the Real car that night. Not Victor Larsen. Sarah exhaled slowly. She knew the truth now. But proving it? That was another battle entirely. Her phone buzzed, making her jump. She grabbed it, expecting another blocked message. Instead, it was Daniel. "We need to meet. Now." Sarah's stomach tightened. Something had happened. She grabbed her coat, stuffed the papers into her bag, and slipped out the door into the cold night air. But as she stepped onto the street, the same black car from earlier was parked near the corner. Waiting. Watching. Sarah's pulse quickened. Whoever was inside wasn't just observing her anymore. They were making their next move. And she had just walked straight into it. The black car's engine hummed softly in the cold night air. Sarah's breath hitched, but she forced herself to stay calm. If she showed fear, she'd already lost. The street was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual sounds of the city, distant sirens, honking cars, people talking, felt muffled. And then, the car door opened. A man stepped out. He wasn't dressed like a thug. He wore a sharp black suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression unreadable. But his presence sent a clear message. Sarah had gotten too close. And now, they were here to warn her. She took a slow step backward, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. "Miss Jacobs," the man said, his voice eerily calm. "You've been very busy." Sarah didn't respond. She was busy calculating. If she ran, would she make it? If she screamed, would anyone hear? The man took a step closer. "You're a smart girl. Smarter than most. But smart people know when to stop." Sarah's heartbeat pounded in her ears. The man sighed, tilting his head slightly. "You want to know the truth, don't you?" Sarah swallowed. "I already know it." The man smirked. "Then you know how dangerous it is." Sarah didn't look away. "The truth isn't dangerous. Lies are." The man chuckled. "That's cute." Then his face darkened. "But you should understand something, Miss Jacobs. This isn't a game. You think you're just uncovering facts. But facts can get people hurt." Sarah held her ground. "People are already getting hurt. Like Victor Larsen." The man's eyes flickered with something. Annoyance? Amusement? It was hard to tell. "Victor Larsen is a nobody," he said dismissively. "You, on the other hand, You have a future. Why throw it away? Sarah clenched her jaw. If I walk away, an innocent man goes to prison. A guilty one walks free. And people like you keep doing whatever you want. The man sighed again, as if disappointed. I was hoping you'd be more reasonable. Then, without another word, he turned, walked back to the car, and got in. The black vehicle pulled away, vanishing down the street. Sarah stood frozen, her heart still hammering in her chest. That hadn't been just a warning. That had been a test. And now they knew. She wasn't backing down. Sarah rushed toward the diner where Daniel had asked to meet. The little 24-hour restaurant was mostly empty, the flickering neon sign casting a dull glow onto the sidewalk. She spotted Daniel in a booth near the back. He looked up as she approached, his face lined with worry. You okay? He asked the moment she slid into the seat. Sarah hesitated. They followed me. Daniel swore under his breath. Did they say anything? They wanted me to back off. They said I was getting too close. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. Of course they did. Sarah leaned forward. That means we're right, doesn't it? If they weren't scared, they wouldn't care what I found. Daniel nodded. Yeah, but it also means they're going to fight back. Sarah pulled her bag onto the table and unzipped it. Then we need to move fast. She pulled out the papers, documents, witness statements, inconsistencies in the case. Daniel studied them, his eyes scanning the pages quickly. This is solid, he muttered. If we can tie Harrison Locke's son to the accident, we can blow this case open. Sarah nodded. We just need one final piece. Something undeniable. Daniel tapped a page. The security footage from the second traffic camera. The one that wasn't included in the official evidence list. Sarah gritted her teeth. Because someone made sure it disappeared. Daniel exhaled. I might know where to find it. Sarah's head snapped up. Where? Daniel hesitated. An old contact of mine. But it won't be easy. We're running out of time. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. Then we go now. Daniel looked at her seriously. Sarah, this is dangerous. You just got threatened. If we go after this, they might come after you for real. Sarah met his gaze. Then let's make sure it's worth it. The next hour was a blur. Daniel drove them to the edge of the city, toward a rundown storage facility that looked abandoned. An old journalist friend of mine keeps backups of sensitive files, he explained as they stepped out of the car. If anyone has that missing footage, it's him. They walked toward a metal door, and Daniel knocked twice. After a long pause, the door creaked open. An older man peered out, his face weathered, his eyes sharp. Daniel Graves, he said flatly. Didn't think I'd see you again. Daniel forced a smile. Nice to see you too, Rick. Rick's gaze flickered to Sarah. And who's the kid? Sarah crossed her arms. The reason you're about to make history. Rick raised an eyebrow. Bold. Daniel sighed. Look, Rick, we don't have time for games. We need the footage from the second traffic camera. The one from the night of the hit and run. Rick frowned. That footage was wiped. Sarah stepped forward. Not completely. If someone erased it, then someone had to back it up first. Maybe someone like you. Rick's expression didn't change. Then, slowly, he smirked. You really are sharp, kid. He turned, disappearing into the darkened room. A few minutes later, he returned, holding a small hard drive. This is it, he said, handing it to Daniel. Raw footage. No edits. No cover-ups. Sarah's fingers tingled as she stared at it. This was the proof they needed. Daniel tucked the drive into his jacket. Thanks, Rick. We owe you one. Rick chuckled. Just make sure the world sees the truth. Sarah nodded. That's the plan. As they left the storage facility, Sarah couldn't help but feel a small spark of victory. They had it. The final piece. But as Daniel pulled the car onto the road, headlights appeared behind them. Bright. Blinding. A black SUV. And it was coming fast. Sarah's stomach dropped. They found us, Daniel muttered. Then, the SUV accelerated and slammed into them. The car spun. Sarah's breath was ripped from her lungs as the world twisted violently around her. Then, everything went black. Sarah's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, everything was a blur. Flashing lights, muffled voices, the metallic taste of blood on her tongue. Pain shot through her side. The seatbelt had saved her, but the impact had been brutal. Where was Daniel? She turned her head. The car was tilted on its side, smoke curling from the engine. The windshield was shattered, and Daniel was slumped over the steering wheel, groaning softly. Daniel. Sarah's voice was hoarse. She reached for him, shaking his shoulder. He let out a low grunt. Still here, he muttered, blinking blearily. His forehead was bleeding, but he was alive. That was when Sarah heard the sound. A car door opening. The black SUV. They weren't done yet. Fear tightened around Sarah's chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Daniel, we need to move, she whispered urgently. Daniel winced as he tried to push himself up. The drive. Sarah's breath caught. The hard drive. The only solid proof they had. It had been in Daniel's jacket pocket. But now, her stomach dropped. The impact had knocked it loose. She spotted it on the shattered windshield, just out of reach. Then, heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. They were coming. Sarah's mind raced. They couldn't let the hard drive fall into the wrong hands. Stay here, she whispered. Daniel groaned. Not a chance. Daniel, you're hurt, she hissed. Let me handle this. Before he could argue, Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and braced herself. Every muscle in her body screamed as she pushed the car door open. She crawled out, her heart hammering. The black SUV was parked just a few feet away, its headlights casting long shadows on the road. A man stood beside it. The same man from earlier. The one who had warned her. Only this time, there was no smirk on his face. Just cold determination. Sarah's fingers twitched. She had no weapon, no plan. Just her wits. And that would have to be enough. 3 weeks ago, Sarah had learned something important about fear. Fear wasn't about what you felt. It was about what you did with it. She had felt fear when she first uncovered the truth. She had felt fear when she had been warned to walk away. She had felt fear when she had been followed. But every time, she had chosen to push forward anyway. Because courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about standing your ground despite the fear. And that's exactly what she planned to do now. The man took a step toward her. Give me the drive, Miss Jacobs. Sarah didn't move. You caused the accident. He shrugged. Regrettable, but necessary. You were going too far. Sarah's fingers curled into fists. You don't want the truth coming out. The man sighed. Let me give you some advice. Some truths? They're better off buried. Sarah shook her head. Not this one. His eyes darkened. You're stubborn, but you're just a kid. You don't understand how the world works. Sarah lifted her chin. I understand enough to know that an innocent man is in prison because of people like you. The man's jaw tightened. Hand it over, Miss Jacobs. Now. Sarah's mind raced. She needed to stall. She glanced past him, toward the SUV. You're not alone, are you? She said. The man's expression didn't change, but his fingers twitched. That was enough. Sarah lunged. Not for the man. For the drive. She dove toward the car, snatching it from the windshield just as the man realized what she was doing. Stop, he barked. Too late. Sarah turned and ran. Her legs burned as she sprinted down the road. The night air was sharp against her face, but she didn't stop. She heard footsteps behind her. He was chasing her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but she kept going. Then, a car screeched around the corner. Headlights flooded the street. Sarah barely had time to react before the vehicle slammed to a stop beside her. The door flew open. Get in. Sarah didn't hesitate. She dove inside, slamming the door shut just as the tires screeched forward. The man disappeared into the darkness behind them. Sarah's chest heaved as she turned to look at the driver. Her eyes widened. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't anyone she knew. It was a woman, mid-30s, blonde hair tied back, fierce blue eyes locked on the road ahead. Who? Sarah started. The woman cut her off. You want to stay alive? Then hold on. The car shot forward, disappearing into the night. Sarah's pulse pounded as the car sped through the dark streets, tires screeching as the mysterious woman maneuvered sharply around a corner. The SUV that had been chasing her was nowhere in sight. For now, Sarah gripped the seat, trying to steady her breath. Who are you? She demanded. The woman kept her eyes on the road. A friend. Sarah narrowed her eyes. I don't have friends who drive getaway cars. The woman smirked slightly, but didn't look away from the road. You do now? Sarah glanced down at the hard drive still clutched in her hand. The only solid proof tying Harrison Locke's son to the hit and run. The proof that someone was willing to kill for. She swallowed hard. How did you know where to find me? The woman finally glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Let's just say you've been making a lot of noise. People are paying attention. Sarah stiffened. Which people? The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she took another sharp turn, pulling the car onto a quiet side street. She killed the engine, casting them into an eerie silence. Then she turned fully to face Sarah. Listen, kid. You've just stepped into something big. You think this is just about one case, but it's not. Sarah gripped the hard drive tighter. What are you saying? The woman sighed, running a hand through her hair. I'm saying that if you don't start playing this smart, you won't make it to the end of this fight. Sarah frowned. And you're here to help? The woman leaned back. Let's just say I don't like when powerful men rewrite the truth to protect themselves. And I really don't like when they hurt people to do it. Sarah studied her carefully. She wasn't sure if she trusted this woman. But trust wasn't something Sarah had the luxury of right now. The only thing that mattered was getting this hard drive into the right hands. Daniel. Sarah jolted upright. Wait, Daniel. The woman's expression darkened. Your lawyer friend? He's still at the crash site. He's alive, but you can't go back right now. Sarah's stomach twisted. She hated leaving him behind, but she knew the woman was right. If she went back now, she'd be walking straight into a trap. She exhaled sharply. Then we need to make this count. The woman nodded. That's the plan. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a burner phone. Take this. You can't use your own phone anymore. They're probably tracking it. Sarah hesitated, then took the phone. And what about you? Who are you really? The woman smirked. Call me Claire. Sarah still wasn't sure if she trusted her. But for now, she had no choice. 3 weeks ago, Sarah had learned something important about trust. It wasn't about believing in people blindly. It was about knowing who had something to lose and who had something to gain. Right now, Claire had something to lose. And that meant, for the moment, they were on the same side. Sarah took a deep breath. What's the plan? Claire's smirk faded. We take down the locks. For good. Sarah tightened her grip on the hard drive. Then let's do it. Claire put the car into drive, and they disappeared into the night. But Sarah knew this was far from over. Because now, the real war had begun. Sarah tightened her grip on the burner phone as Claire drove them through the city's darkened streets. The adrenaline from the crash was still coursing through her veins, but she forced herself to focus. The hard drive in her lap held the truth, proof that Harrison Locke's son was the real culprit behind the hit and run. But proof meant nothing if it never saw the light of day. Where are we going? She asked. Claire's jaw was set as she gripped the wheel. Somewhere safe. You need a place to lay low while we figure out the next move. Sarah exhaled sharply. We don't have time to lay low. They're already ahead of us. Claire didn't answer right away. She glanced at Sarah through the rearview mirror, her expression unreadable. You don't get it, do you? Sarah frowned. Get what? Claire sighed. You think this is just about proving the truth. But it's not. This is about power. People like the Locks don't just lose. They eliminate threats. Sarah's stomach twisted, but she refused to back down. Then we hit them first. Claire let out a short laugh. You're fearless. I'll give you that. But fearless doesn't mean invincible, kid. Sarah clenched her fists. I'm not trying to be invincible. I'm trying to stop innocent people from getting hurt. Claire glanced at her again, and for the first time, there was something almost like respect in her eyes. All right, she said finally. Then we do this your way. Sarah exhaled in relief. Good. Because I know exactly where we need to go. Claire raised an eyebrow. Where? Sarah met her gaze. The press. 3 weeks ago, Sarah had learned something important about power. Power wasn't about who had the most money. It was about who controlled the story. People like the Locks didn't stay powerful just because they were rich. They stayed powerful because they controlled the narrative. If Sarah wanted to win, she needed to take that control away from them. Claire pulled into a parking lot near an old office building. The Daily Sentinel, Sarah said, nodding toward the sign above the entrance. Claire frowned. The press? You really think they're going to help? Sarah set her jaw. They will if we give them something they can't ignore. Claire hesitated. Then she nodded. All right, let's do it. They stepped out of the car, keeping their heads low as they approached the building. The front doors were locked, but Sarah knocked hard against the glass. Nothing. She knocked again. Still nothing. Claire sighed. It's the middle of the night. No one's here. Sarah didn't budge. Someone's always here. Claire crossed her arms. And if no one answers? Sarah lifted the hard drive. Then we find another way. Before Claire could respond, the door clicked open. A man in his 40s, dressed in a wrinkled button-down and khakis, peered at them with tired eyes. You better have a good reason for banging on my door at 2 in the morning. Sarah met his gaze. Are you James Carter? The man narrowed his eyes. Who's asking? Sarah held up the hard drive. Someone with the biggest story of your career. Carter studied her, then sighed and stepped aside. This better be good. Sarah and Claire exchanged a glance before stepping inside. This was it. The truth was about to go public. Inside the newsroom, Carter led them to a desk cluttered with papers and an empty coffee cup. "Talk fast," he said, sitting down. "I don't do conspiracy theories." Sarah placed the hard drive on the table. "This isn't a theory. It's proof." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" Sarah took a breath. "That Victor Larson was framed for a crime he didn't commit. And the real culprit is Harrison Locke's son." Carter leaned back. "That's a big accusation, kid." Sarah pushed the hard drive toward him. "The footage from the second traffic camera. The one that was erased from the official case files." Carter's eyes flickered with interest. He picked up the hard drive, turning it over in his hands. "If this is real, it could take down one of the most powerful families in the country." "Exactly," Sarah said. Carter was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, let's see what we've got." He plugged the drive into his computer. Sarah held her breath as the file loaded. The screen flickered, then the footage appeared. A dark road, the sound of rain, a green sedan speeding through the intersection, and then, crash, a woman's scream. Then, a second car, just barely visible in the corner of the screen. A black Mercedes. Not Victor Larson's car. A different one entirely. Sarah's heart pounded. There it was. The proof. Carter's face hardened as he watched. This changes everything." Sarah nodded. "Now do you believe me?" Carter exhaled sharply. "Yeah, kid. I believe you." He turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "This needs to go out now." Sarah felt a rush of relief. Finally, the truth was going to be. The lights flickered. Then, boom, a deafening explosion from outside. The entire building shook. Sarah gasped, spinning toward the window. Smoke. Fire. A car outside was in flames. Claire cursed, grabbing Sarah's arm. "We need to go. Now." Carter's face had gone pale. "What the—" Another boom. The power cut out. Sarah's stomach clenched. They weren't just trying to stop the story. They were trying to erase it. Claire grabbed the hard drive from the computer. "No more delays. We get this out before they find us." Sarah nodded, her heart hammering. Because she knew. This wasn't just about the case anymore. Now, it was about survival. Smoke filled the air. Sarah coughed, covering her mouth as the acrid scent of burning fuel stung her nose. The explosion had sent the entire newsroom into chaos. Papers scattered, desks overturned, alarms blaring. And outside, a second black SUV had pulled up. They weren't done yet. Claire shoved the hard drive into Sarah's hands. "Run." Sarah's pulse pounded. "What about you?" "I'll hold them off," Claire snapped, already reaching for the small pistol hidden under her jacket. Sarah hesitated. Then, the newsroom doors burst open. Two men in dark suits stormed in. They moved like professionals, like they had done this before. "Go," Claire barked. Sarah didn't think. She turned and ran. She sprinted down the back hallway, pushing past desks and knocking over chairs as she went. Footsteps pounded behind her. She wasn't alone. Someone was chasing her. Her heart hammered as she reached the emergency exit. She shoved against the door, bursting into the cold night air, and skidded to a stop. A third man was waiting outside. Tall, muscular, unsmiling. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She spun around to go back, but the man behind her had already reached the door. She was trapped. 3 weeks ago, Sarah had learned something important about fear. Fear wasn't about feeling safe. It was about knowing when to fight and when to run. Right now, she needed a third option. The taller man stepped forward. "Give me the drive." Sarah clutched it tighter. He sighed, shaking his head. "Don't be stupid, kid." Sarah's mind raced. She needed an opening, a distraction, something. Her fingers brushed against her pocket. The burner phone. Her thumb pressed against the emergency dial button. It was a gamble, but she was out of options. She held her chin high. "You want the drive? Come take it." The man narrowed his eyes. Then he lunged. Sarah threw the hard drive, not toward him, but over his shoulder. It sailed through the air, straight toward the open sewer grate behind him. His eyes widened. He dived for it, and that was all the time Sarah needed. She ran. The alley was dark and winding, but Sarah knew she had seconds before they recovered. She tore through the narrow passage, weaving between dumpsters and jumping over scattered trash. Behind her, shouts. They were coming. Her lungs burned, but she could not stop. Then, a car screeched to a halt in front of her. Sarah's stomach dropped. Another one of them? The passenger door flew open. "Get in." Sarah's eyes widened. Daniel, bruised, bloodied, but alive. She didn't hesitate. She dove into the car, and Daniel hit the gas. The black SUVs behind them roared to life, tires screeching as they gave chase. "Hold on," Daniel shouted. Sarah barely had time to buckle her seatbelt before the car swerved into the main road. Headlights flashed behind them. They were still being followed. Sarah's pulse raced. "Where did you come from?" Daniel gritted his teeth. "Claire called me before the explosion. Told me to find you." Sarah's hands clenched. "Claire's still inside." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then we get this drive somewhere safe first. Otherwise, everything she's fighting for will be for nothing." Sarah bit her lip, her chest tight. She hated leaving Claire behind, but she knew Daniel was right. She pulled the hard drive from her jacket. "Where do we go?" she asked. Daniel's eyes flickered toward the rearview mirror. "Somewhere they won't expect." Then, he yanked the wheel, and the car veered off the main road, disappearing into the night. The car sped down a darkened side street, the tires skidding slightly as Daniel took a sharp turn. Behind them, the black SUVs were still in pursuit. Sarah clutched the hard drive against her chest, her pulse racing. "They're not giving up," she muttered. Daniel gritted his teeth. "Of course not. You have the one thing that can take them down." Sarah's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The SUVs were gaining. They needed an escape. "Fast." "Where are we going?" she demanded. Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. "Somewhere they won't expect." Sarah swallowed. "That doesn't sound very reassuring." Daniel glanced at her, the corners of his lips twitching. "Trust me." He suddenly veered left, straight into a dimly lit parking garage. Sarah's stomach lurched as the car whipped around a concrete pillar, the headlights cutting through the shadows. Behind them, the SUVs followed. They were trapped. Sarah's breath caught. "Daniel, wait for it," he murmured. The car sped toward the back of the garage, toward what looked like a dead end. Sarah's hands tightened around the seat. "Daniel, we're gonna crash." Then, at the last second, Daniel yanked the emergency brake. The car spun. Tires screeched as the vehicle whipped into a hidden side lane, vanishing behind a row of abandoned trucks. Sarah's stomach flipped. The SUVs didn't turn in time. They sped past the hidden turn, roaring straight toward the dead end. By the time they realized, it was too late. One SUV slammed on its brakes, tires screeching, crashing into a concrete barrier. The second barely stopped in time. Daniel exhaled, watching from the shadows. "That should buy us a few minutes." Sarah let out a shaky breath. "You could have warned me." Daniel smirked. "Where's the fun in that?" Sarah rolled her eyes. "You're insane." But she couldn't deny. That was brilliant. Daniel pulled the car out of the garage, taking the back roads to avoid any more unwanted attention. Sarah's hands were still shaking, but she forced herself to stay focused. They weren't safe yet. "Where are we really going?" she asked again. Daniel's expression darkened. "We can't go to the press anymore. Not after that explosion. They'll be watching every media outlet." Sarah's stomach twisted. "Then what do we do?" Daniel hesitated. Then he sighed. "We take it straight to the courts." Sarah blinked. "What?" Daniel glanced at her. "You want this case reopened? You want justice for Victor Larson? Then we go to someone who has to listen." Sarah's heart pounded. "You mean the judge?" Daniel nodded. "Judge Harrison." Sarah swallowed. Judge Harrison was tough, but he had a reputation for being fair. If anyone would take this seriously, it was him. But that also meant, "We'll be painting a giant target on our backs," Sarah muttered. Daniel exhaled. "We already have one." Sarah bit her lip. He was right. They were already being hunted. The only difference now was whether they went down fighting. She met Daniel's gaze. "Then let's do it." 20 minutes later, they pulled up outside Judge Harrison's house. The neighborhood was dark and quiet, a far cry from the chaos they had just escaped. Sarah's pulse quickened. What if he doesn't listen? Daniel cut the engine and turned to her. "Then we make him listen." Sarah nodded, gripping the hard drive tightly. Then, together, they walked up the steps and knocked on the door. Seconds passed. Then, a light flickered on. Footsteps. The door creaked open, revealing Judge Harrison in a robe, his expression groggy and annoyed. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" he grumbled. Daniel didn't hesitate. "We have proof that Victor Larson was framed." The judge's eyes snapped to them. The sleepiness vanished from his face. He glanced around, then stepped aside. "Come in." Sarah swallowed hard. This was it. The final play. The last chance to expose the truth. And the moment that would change everything. Judge Harrison closed the door behind them, locking it with a sharp click. His sharp, calculating eyes flickered between Sarah and Daniel, his face unreadable. "You have proof?" he asked, his voice steady but low. Sarah nodded, stepping forward. She placed the hard drive on the judge's coffee table. "Everything is on here. The real footage from the second traffic camera, the altered police reports, and the connection to Harrison Locke's son." The judge didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the small drive sitting between them. Then, he exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "Do you two have any idea what you've just done?" Daniel crossed his arms. "Yeah, we just uncovered one of the biggest cover-ups in the state's history." The judge let out a humorless chuckle. "And now you've got a price on your heads." Sarah stiffened. "So what?" she snapped. "We're supposed to just let Victor Larson rot in prison for something he didn't do? Let the Locks walk free just because they're rich?" The judge's eyes snapped to her. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a smirk. "You remind me of someone," he muttered. Sarah frowned. "Who?" The judge leaned back, studying her carefully. "Me. A long time ago." Sarah blinked. Daniel cleared his throat. "So, are you going to help us, or are we wasting our time?" The judge sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You two really don't know how deep this goes, do you?" Sarah crossed her arms. "Enlighten us." The judge let out another sigh, then stood. He walked over to a locked drawer in his desk, pulled out a key from his robe pocket, and unlocked it. Sarah and Daniel exchanged a look. The judge pulled out a thick file, flipping through the pages. "This case isn't just about Victor Larson," he said, tossing a stack of documents onto the table. "It's about how many other cases the Locks have buried. How many people have been paid off? How many judges have been bought?" Sarah's stomach twisted. "You knew?" The judge met her gaze. "I suspected." Sarah clenched her fists. "And you did nothing?" Judge Harrison's jaw tightened. "You think it's that easy?" He gestured to the papers. "I've been trying to build a case against them for years. But without solid proof, I was powerless." Daniel nodded toward the hard drive. "And now?" The judge stared at it for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "Now we take them down." The next 24 hours were a blur. Judge Harrison called in trusted federal investigators, people who couldn't be bought. The footage was authenticated. The falsified police reports were traced back to corrupt officials. And before dawn, Harrison Locke's son was arrested. The news broke fast. The press swarmed the courthouse, reporting every detail of the cover-up. The Locke's legal team scrambled to do damage control, but the evidence was everywhere. Sarah sat on the courthouse steps, exhausted, watching reporters fight over interviews. Daniel sat beside her, stretching his sore shoulder. "You did it, kid." Sarah shook her head. "We did it." Daniel smirked. "Yeah, but you definitely did most of the work." Sarah let out a soft laugh. "I guess being stubborn has its perks." Daniel chuckled. "That, and being a legal genius with a dangerously high IQ." Sarah smiled, but it faded as she looked toward the jailhouse across the street. Victor Larson, the innocent man who had spent months in prison for something he didn't do. She swallowed hard. "When do they let him out?" Daniel sighed. "Judge Harrison is expediting the process. By tomorrow morning, he'll be free." Sarah exhaled, feeling a wave of relief. But she wasn't smiling, because she knew this wasn't over. The Locks were powerful, and while their grip on the legal system had just taken a serious hit, they weren't going to disappear quietly. They were going to come back, stronger, angrier, and the people who had taken them down, they would remember. Daniel nudged her shoulder. "Hey, we won. Take the victory." Sarah forced a small smile. "For now." Daniel chuckled. "Always thinking ahead, huh?" Sarah nodded. Because she wasn't just thinking ahead. She was planning. The law wasn't just about winning one case. It was about making sure the truth always won. And Sarah Jacobs? She wasn't going to stop now. Not ever.